Rome's rise from a small city-state to a sprawling empire was marked by relentless military campaigns, strategic diplomacy, and an unwavering desire to assert dominance over neighboring regions. While the Roman legions were renowned for their tactical brilliance and disciplined formations, there was another, less discussed aspect of Roman conquest that reveals the empire's brutal and calculated methods of control, the treatment of captured royal women. These queens were far more than mere symbols of their nations. They embodied the authority, dignity, and sovereignty of the kingdoms they ruled. To capture them was to humiliate an entire people, sending a chilling message about the futility of resistance against Rome's might. From the earliest days of the Republic through the height of the Empire, Roman generals viewed the capture of royalty as a critical element of victory. Unlike ordinary prisoners of war, queens and noblewomen carried immense political weight. Their fates could determine the stability of conquered regions, influence the loyalty of local elites, and even impact the succession of dynasties. By targeting queens, Rome effectively dismantled the ruling structure of enemy states, ensuring that no legitimate leadership could rise in opposition to its authority. The strategy was both practical and psychological. Practical because removing a leader destabilized governance, and psychological because it instilled fear, demonstrating that even those at the pinnacle of power were not immune to Rome's reach. The process of conquest was often swift and merciless. Cities that resisted faced devastation, with entire populations enslaved or massacred. Amid this chaos, queens and princesses were singled out for capture. The Romans understood that the humiliation of a queen served as a symbolic victory far greater than the taking of land or resources. Historical accounts from Tacitus, Livy, and Suetonius describe the deliberate focus on capturing royal women, portraying them as both trophies and instruments of statecraft. One notable example is Cleopatra VII of Egypt, whose political acumen and status as a queen made her a target for Rome's ambitions. While Cleopatra's story is well documented, countless other queens from Gaul, Britannia, and the Near East faced similar fates, often lost to history, except for brief mentions in Roman records. The capture of these women was rarely an act of mere imprisonment. Roman generals and officials carefully orchestrated the removal of queens to ensure maximum humiliation and political leverage. Once seized, these women were stripped of their regal titles, forbidden from exercising authority, and removed from the spheres of influence that had once defined their lives. They were forced to navigate a world where their previous status offered no protection, where their identities as rulers were erased and replaced with the label of prisoner or captive. This stripping away of sovereignty was a profound psychological assault. To the people of the conquered kingdom, seeing their queen reduced to a powerless figure was a brutal lesson. Rome did not simply defeat armies. It destroyed the symbols of national pride and governance. Captive queens were often transported over great distances to Rome itself, subjected to grueling journeys under harsh conditions. Many were paraded in public spaces, displayed as living trophies during triumphal processions, where Roman citizens celebrated the empire's military victories with feasts, games, and spectacle. For the queens themselves, this was an ordeal that combined exhaustion, fear, and humiliation. They were forced to confront the fact that their power and dignity were now subservient to the whims of their captors, performing in a public theater of shame that reinforced the empire's supremacy. In this context, the act of capture was not merely a military necessity, it was a performance designed to consolidate Roman authority and demoralize any potential resistance. Rome's treatment of captive queens was not uniform. It varied depending on the political objectives of the conquerors, the perceived threat posed by the captive, and the whims of individual generals. Some queens were placed under the control of high-ranking officials or emperors, living under surveillance but spared the most extreme forms of abuse. Others faced harsher fates, including enslavement, forced labor, or even execution if their influence threatened Roman control. The calculus was always strategic. A queen could be spared if she served as a useful pawn in negotiations or diplomacy, but if she represented a lingering threat, Her suffering could be both a warning to others and a tool to consolidate dominance. The strategic value of capturing queens extended beyond immediate political control. By holding a queen hostage, Rome could manipulate entire populations, negotiating terms of surrender, ensuring loyalty from former rivals, or compelling cooperation from rebellious factions. The personal suffering of the queen was inextricably linked to the political objectives of the empire. In many cases, the fear of further humiliation or death prevented conquered peoples from rising against Roman authority, demonstrating how the personal torment of a single royal woman could ripple outward, shaping the destinies of entire nations. The psychological impact on the queens themselves cannot be overstated. These were women who had grown up in the corridors of power, accustomed to making decisions that shaped the fate of kingdoms. To be suddenly reduced to a pawn in a foreign empire's games was devastating. Many attempted to maintain their dignity, engaging in subtle forms of resistance, negotiation, or diplomacy, even under captivity. Some wrote letters, maintained clandestine correspondence with supporters, or attempted to influence Roman policy in ways that would protect their people. Others, overwhelmed by the loss of power and autonomy, succumbed to despair. Suicide, either through poison or other means, was not uncommon, a final act of defiance in a world where all other forms of agency had been stripped away. Historical records suggest that Rome's approach to captive queens left a lasting imprint on the cultural memory of conquered regions. Tales of cruelty, humiliation, and political manipulation spread among the subjugated populations, contributing to a collective understanding of Roman power as both absolute and ruthless. The capture of queens was more than a military tactic. It was a statement about the nature of empire, one in which physical conquest, psychological domination, and strategic humiliation combined to ensure the perpetuation of Roman supremacy. In conclusion, the capture of royal women by Rome was a calculated and deliberate act designed to achieve maximum political, psychological, and social effect. These queens were more than mere prisoners. They were living symbols of conquered nations, embodiments of sovereignty, and instruments of statecraft. Their capture demonstrated Rome's ability to subvert not only armies and cities, but the very essence of leadership and power itself. The brutality of these actions, the psychological torment inflicted, and the enduring consequences for both the women and their nations reveal a darker side of Roman conquest, one where victory was measured not only in territory, but in the complete subjugation of rulers and the erasure of their dignity. Through these historical episodes, we gain insight into an empire whose strength was not solely martial, but deeply entwined with its capacity for calculated cruelty and political theatre, ensuring that the echoes of its dominance were felt long after the initial conquestone of the most devastating tactics Rome employed against captive queens was the deliberate and public humiliation of these royal women. While the capture itself stripped them of political authority, the Romans understood that humiliation could serve as an even more potent instrument of power. Public shame, when inflicted on figures of prominence, sent a message not only to the conquered peoples, but also to the citizens of Rome, reinforcing the empire's image of invincibility and the futility of resistance. The spectacle of a once mighty queen reduced to a vulnerable and subjugated figure was more than symbolic. It was a calculated display designed to consolidate Roman authority and terrorize any who might consider defiance. Triumphal processions were perhaps the most infamous stage for these acts of public degradation. When a general returned victorious from a campaign, the streets of Rome became a theater of power, where military spoils and prisoners were paraded before cheering crowds. Captive queens were forced to walk in these processions, often in chains or adorned in garments meant to emphasize their fall from grace. These women were no longer rulers. They were trophies, objects of spectacle and political messaging. The triumphs were lavish, with banners, statues, exoti, sea animals, and spoils from conquered territories, all culminating in the visual reinforcement of Roman supremacy. The presence of a humiliated queen among the spoils added an emotional and psychological weight, demonstrating to both Romans and foreigners alike that even royalty could be brought low by Rome. The psychological impact on the captive queens themselves was profound. Many had been raised in palaces of opulence, accustomed to respect, ceremony, and the unquestioned obedience of courtiers and subjects. To be paraded before a jeering populace, stripped of dignity, and made to endure the gaze of thousands, was an intentional assault on identity and self-worth. Contemporary accounts, such as those of the historian Tacitus, describe the visible anxiety and distress of these women, emphasizing their suffering not as incidental to military victory, but as a deliberate instrument of political control. Public humiliation was not merely collateral damage, it was a strategic tool, carefully designed to erode morale, instill fear, and demonstrate Rome's absolute power over the human and political symbols of conquered realms. Humiliation extended beyond the spectacle of processions. Captive queens were often subjected to various forms of social degradation in Rome and its provinces. They could be forced to participate in ritualistic ceremonies that mocked their former status, live under the scrutiny of Roman elites who treated them as objects of curiosity, or endure the scorn of servants and minor officials. Their every action was monitored, their autonomy severely restricted, and their attempts at resistance punished with even greater public scrutiny. This constant visibility, combined with the lack of personal agency, created a psychological prison that was often as suffocating as physical confinement. The message was clear. These queens were no longer sovereigns, they were tools of Roman dominance, their suffering a demonstration to all of the cost of opposition. The use of public humiliation was particularly effective because it targeted more than just the captive queens. It affected entire populations. By witnessing the degradation of their leaders, subject peoples were psychologically conditioned to accept Roman rule as both inevitable and absolute. The fall of a queen signified the fall of her kingdom in symbolic terms, reinforcing the narrative that resistance was futile. Families, communities, and neighboring states could see the tangible consequences of defying Rome, creating a climate of fear that extended far beyond the immediate military conquest. Public humiliation, therefore, was not merely personal punishment, it was a deliberate act of social engineering designed to reshape the perceptions of power and submission across the empire. Certain historical examples illustrate the devastating efficacy of this tactic. Boudica, Queen of the Iceni in Britain, led a formidable rebellion against Roman occupation in 60 to 61 CE. Though she initially achieved remarkable victories, her eventual defeat was followed by widespread efforts to erase her influence and degrade her memory. Roman historians describe the humiliation of Boudica's family and supporters as part of a larger strategy to assert control over the conquered province. Similarly, the wives and daughters of defeated kings in Gaul and Germania were frequently paraded through Roman cities, their dignity stripped to emphasize the supremacy of Roman arms. In these cases, humiliation was not incidental to victory. It was an integral part of the conquest, carefully engineered to cement Roman dominance in both the physical and symbolic realms. Roman leaders understood that public humiliation could also serve domestic political purposes. Victorious generals used the display of active queens to enhance their own reputations, demonstrating military prowess, strategic acumen, and the favor of the gods. The Senate and the populace would judge a general's career not merely by battlefield victories, but by the spectacle of his triumphs, which often hinged on the submission of high-profile captives. For queens, this meant their suffering became a currency in the political ambitions of their conquerors. Their dignity and autonomy were secondary to the prestige and advancement of Roman leaders, reducing them to instruments in a broader struggle for power within the empire itself. The humiliation inflicted upon captive queens often left lasting scars. Beyond the immediate trauma of public degradation, many faced long-term consequences, including social ostracization, enforced servitude, and restrictions on marriage or personal freedom. In some cases, queens were confined to remote villas or kept under strict surveillance, where every interaction was controlled to prevent political influence. Even in captivity, they were constantly reminded of their loss of status and power. The psychological toll was immense: the loss of agency, the constant scrutiny, and the memory of public shaming could lead to despair, depression, and in some cases, suicide. Roman humiliation was not a transient punishment, it was a lifelong mark, designed to assert dominance through enduring psychological and social consequences. Yet, despite the brutality, many queens exhibited remarkable resilience. Some navigated their captivity with intelligence and cunning, negotiating privileges, maintaining networks of influence, or subtly manipulating their circumstances to protect themselves or their people. Others engaged in acts of quiet defiance, refusing to bow to Roman expectations or maintaining their dignity despite relentless efforts to break them. These acts of resistance, though often constrained, highlight the human dimension of these historical episodes. Even in the face of systematic humiliation, captive queens could assert a form of agency, challenging Rome's authority in small but significant ways. In conclusion, public humiliation was a cornerstone of Roman strategy against captive queens, serving multiple purposes: psychological warfare, political messaging, social control, and domestic political advantage. By reducing queens to objects of spectacle, Rome demonstrated its ability to dominate not only armies and cities, but the very symbols of sovereignty and power. The effects of such humiliation were profound and enduring, shaping the lives of the captives and the perceptions of entire populations. Understanding this aspect of Roman conquest reveals a calculated cruelty that extended beyond the battlefield, a recognition that true power often lay not merely in victory, but in the ability to break the spirit of those who once held it. Through these carefully orchestrated displays of degradation, Rome ensured that its dominion was felt not only in lands conquered, but in the hearts and minds of all who witnessed the fall of a queen. Horrors of Roman conquest did not end with the public humiliation of captive queens. For many, the subsequent phase of captivity, enforced slavery and sexual exploitation, represented a deeper, more intimate form of domination. Unlike the visible spectacle of parades and triumphs, these acts occurred behind closed doors, in the private spheres of Roman households, palaces, and villas. Here, the power dynamics of empire were laid bare. Queens who had once ruled over nations and commanded armies were reduced to servants, concubines, and instruments of pleasure for their captors. This brutal subjugation was as much a political strategy as it was a personal violation, stripping these women of autonomy, dignity, and the very essence of their sovereignty. Enslavement of captive queens was often both systematic and calculated. Unlike ordinary prisoners of war, whose lives might be spared but relegated to menial labor, queens and noblewomen were highly valued precisely because of their status. Their captivity offered an opportunity to reinforce Roman dominance on multiple levels. Placed in the households of generals, senators, or even the emperor himself, these women were constantly reminded of their fall from power. They were expected to perform domestic duties, supervise other enslaved women, or participate in ceremonies that underscored their new subservience. The act of reducing a queen to a domestic servant carried immense symbolic weight, demonstrating that even the highest-ranking individuals of a conquered society could be brought to obedience. Sexual exploitation was, tragically, a common and devastating aspect of this captivity. Roman law and social norms allowed, and often encouraged, the use of enslaved women as concubines or sexual partners for their masters. Captive queens were not exempt. For men of power, possessing a queen was a mark of prestige, a tangible symbol of victory and dominance over a former rival kingdom. Accounts from historians such as Tacitus and Cassius Dio, though sometimes biased, indicate that sexual subjugation was not simply opportunistic, it was deeply entwined with the political logic of conquest. By controlling the bodies of these women, Rome controlled their status, their influence, and, by extension, the populations they once ruled. Sexual exploitation became a tool of empire, intertwining personal degradation with strategic subjugation. The psychological and emotional toll of such exploitation was catastrophic. Queens who had been accustomed to authority, respect, and ceremonial reverence suddenly faced a reality in which their value was measured by their utility to their captors. Their former lives, of councils, diplomacy, and public leadership, were replaced with forced obedience, sexual coercion, and the constant threat of punishment. The trauma of being used as a sexual object by their conquerors was compounded by the knowledge that these acts served a political purpose. Every violation was a reminder to their subjects that resistance was futile and that Rome could dominate not only lands and armies, but the most private aspects of human life. The experiences of captive queens varied depending on the attitudes of individual Roman officials and the strategic goals of the empire. Some women were assigned to the households of the elite as concubines or personal attendants, while others were married forcibly to Roman commanders to cement political alliances or legitimize new governance structures. These arrangements were often coerced, leaving queens with little agency. In some cases, marriages were intended to produce children who could serve as symbols of integration between Roman authority and conquered peoples, further entangling personal violation with statecraft. The manipulation of familial and sexual relationships highlights the depth of Rome's strategic cruelty. By controlling reproduction, intimacy, and loyalty, the empire extended its reach into the very bloodlines of those it subjugated. Historical examples reveal the breadth and intensity of this abuse. Cleopatra VII, though ultimately remembered as a politically astute ruler, endured years of manipulation and coercion at the hands of Roman leaders, particularly Julius Caesar and later Mark Antony. While her interactions were complex, they reflected the delicate balance between personal agency and political survival under the scrutiny of a dominant empire. Other, lesser-known queens in Gaul, Germania, and the Near East faced more brutal realities, forced into servitude, stripped of all autonomy, and subjected to sexual exploitation as a demonstration of Roman power. These women often vanished from historical records, their stories reduced to marginal notes, yet their suffering illustrates the systemic nature of Rome's cruelty toward female captives. The use of sexual exploitation as a tool of political control also extended to the communities from which these queens came. By violating a queen, Rome symbolically violated the honor and integrity of the conquered state. The sexual subjugation of these women served as a warning to the population. Resistance would lead not only to military defeat, but also to the degradation of their leaders and the desecration of their societal values. This psychological strategy ensured that fear and submission were ingrained in the collective consciousness, reinforcing Roman authority through terror as much as through conquest. The trauma inflicted upon captive queens often had long-term consequences for both the individuals and their nations. Some women, unable to withstand the combination of public humiliation, enslavement, and sexual exploitation, took their own lives as a final act of defiance. Others survived but endured ongoing suffering, trapped in circumstances where their previous status offered no protection. Their descendants, if they survived, were often used to consolidate Roman control, marrying into Roman families or raised under the watchful eyes of officials to prevent rebellion. The personal agony of the queens thus became intertwined with the broader strategy of empire, where individual suffering reinforced political dominance across generations. Despite the immense cruelty, many queens demonstrated extraordinary resilience. Some adapted to their circumstances, leveraging their knowledge of politics, culture, and diplomacy to maintain influence. Even within the confines of captivity, others used their enforced proximity to Roman leaders to negotiate better treatment for themselves or their people, subtly manipulating the power dynamics of subjugation. These acts of agency, though constrained, highlight the remarkable fortitude of women who, despite the systematic efforts to degrade them, sought ways to preserve dignity, protect their subjects, and navigate the treacherous waters of imperial domination. The treatment of captive queens as slaves and objects of sexual exploitation underscores the intersection of personal suffering and political strategy in Roman imperialism. By targeting women who had previously embodied sovereignty and authority, Rome sent a clear message: conquest was not merely about defeating armies or seizing territory, it was about controlling the symbols and agents of power itself. The empire's ability to subjugate even the most prominent individuals demonstrated its comprehensive approach to domination, combining physical force, psychological terror, and sexual control to reinforce its supremacy. In conclusion, the enforced slavery and sexual exploitation of captive queens represents one of the darkest and most intimate dimensions of Roman conquest. These women, who had once wielded immense authority, were reduced to instruments of political and personal control, their bodies and identities appropriated to serve the interests of the empire. The practice was both strategic and symbolic, ensuring that the psychological, social, and political consequences of Rome's victories extended far beyond the battlefield. By examining these grim realities, we gain a deeper understanding of the comprehensive nature of Roman power, a system that conquered not only lands and armies, but the autonomy, dignity, and very essence of those who once ruled. Through their suffering, the mechanisms of empire were laid bare, revealing a calculated cruelty designed to dominate every aspect of life and to enforce the permanence of Rome's dominance over all who opposed it, while public humiliation and enforced slavery represented the overt aspects of Rome's domination of captive queens. A more insidious form of control lay in manipulation, betrayal, and coercion. These tactics were often subtle, psychological, and highly strategic, designed to strip queens of autonomy while simultaneously reinforcing Rome's political and military dominance. Captive queens were not only symbols of conquered realms, they were also bargaining chips in the intricate games of diplomacy and power that defined Roman imperial strategy. Their fates were rarely determined by mercy. Instead, they were shaped by the calculated manipulation of both their ambitions and their fears. Rome recognized that the political influence of queens did not vanish with captivity. Even when removed from their thrones, these women could inspire loyalty, incite rebellion, or serve as rallying points for resistance movements. To neutralize this threat, the empire often employed coercion and psychological manipulation, transforming queens from sovereign rulers into instruments of Roman policy. One common method was the strategic use of hostageship. By holding a queen in captivity, Rome could compel the cooperation of her subjects or force the surrender of strategic territories. The queen's survival depended not only on obedience but also on her willingness to act in ways dictated by her captors. In this context, coercion was not merely a personal torment. It was a political lever, extending Rome's influence deep into the heart of conquered societies. Manipulation often took the form of promises, threats, and forced choices that created impossible moral dilemmas for captive queens. Generals and officials might offer conditional freedom, improved treatment, or restoration of status in exchange for compliance with Roman demands. At the same time, they would threaten violence, enslavement, or the execution of family members should the queen resist. These calculated moves placed the captive in a position where every decision carried devastating consequences, not only for herself, but for those loyal to her. The interplay of hope and fear created a psychological trap from which few could escape, illustrating how Roman power extended beyond the physical realm into the manipulation of mind, loyalty, and ethical obligation. Betrayal was another pervasive tool. Queens were often forced to act against their own people or allies, sometimes under duress, sometimes through subtle coercion. They might be required to disclose secrets of state, endorse Roman policies, or legitimize new rulers installed by the empire. In some cases, they were used to mediate between Rome and rebellious factions, essentially becoming intermediaries who were compelled to act against the very interests of their former kingdoms. The moral and emotional toll of such betrayals was immense. Queens faced the constant pressure of choosing between personal survival and the welfare of their people. a choice that could never be entirely reconciled and which left enduring psychological scars. Historical accounts highlight the devastating effects of coercion and manipulation. After the defeat of Carthage, for example, Roman historians describe how prominent women of the Punic elite were used to secure political compliance, serve as hostages, and symbolize the total submission of the defeated state. These women were often caught in a web of impossible expectations: obey Rome or risk death, betray their people or witness the collapse of everything they had known. In Gaul, Germania, and the Near East, similar patterns emerged. Captive queens became political instruments, their personal suffering inextricably tied to broader imperial strategy. The narratives of these women, though sometimes fragmented or filtered through Roman historiography, reveal a consistent pattern of exploitation, manipulation, and coercion as tools of empire. Coercion also extended into forced marriages, often arranged to serve Rome's political goals. Captive queens could be married to Roman generals, senators, or local collaborators in a manner that simultaneously legitimized Roman authority and weakened local resistance. These unions were rarely consensual. Queens were compelled to participate under threat of violence or continued degradation. The marriages served multiple purposes. They allowed Rome to consolidate control over conquered territories, create dynastic connections that reinforced imperial influence, and symbolically erase the independence of the queen's former sovereignty. In this way, coercion became a tool not only of immediate control but also of long-term political engineering. The manipulation of captive queens was rarely limited to immediate political gain. It often had intergenerational implications. Children born of these coerced unions could be raised under Roman supervision, effectively blending conquered and conqueror bloodlines to ensure loyalty or reduce the likelihood of rebellion. Queens themselves were forced into complicity in this process, further entrenching their subjugation. The personal cost was immense, as they were forced to participate in a system designed to co-opt their lineage and influence for the benefit of an empire that had taken everything from them. Their identities, once rooted in sovereignty and dignity, became entangled with the mechanisms of control imposed by their captors. Psychologically, the effects of manipulation and coercion were profound and often lifelong. Captive KNS lived under constant surveillance, where any act of defiance could result in punishment or further exploitation. Trust became nearly impossible, as their every interaction was scrutinized by those seeking to maintain control. Even when allowed limited freedoms or privileges, these were often contingent upon cooperation with Rome's demands, leaving queens perpetually aware that their autonomy was an illusion. The tension between survival and principle, between personal dignity and political necessity, created a relentless cycle of stress, fear, and moral compromise that few could endure without psychological or emotional damage. Yet, despite the intensity of these pressures, many queens demonstrated remarkable resilience. Some skillfully navigated the manipulations of their captors, finding ways to influence decisions, protect allies, or mitigate the harm done to their people. Others engaged in subtle forms of resistance, refusing to comply with certain orders or maintaining secret communications with loyalists. These acts, though constrained by the omnipresent threat of punishment, reveal the extraordinary intelligence and courage required to survive within the coercive machinery of Roman power. Even when forced into betrayal or moral compromise, queens could exercise agency in small but meaningful ways, challenging the notion that captivity equated to total submission. The use of manipulation, betrayal, and coercion highlights the sophistication of Roman imperial strategy. Unlike mere physical domination, these tactics required psychological insight, an understanding of political dynamics, and an ability to exploit both ambition and fear. Captive queens, with their intelligence, influence, and symbolic importance, were prime targets for these forms of control. By leveraging manipulation and coercion, Rome ensured that conquest extended far beyond the battlefield, reaching into the very minds and moral frameworks of those it subdued. This method of domination illustrates a form of power that is as enduring as it is insidious, demonstrating Rome's capacity to control not only the physical world, but the social, emotional, and political landscapes of conquered regions. In conclusion, the manipulation, betrayal, and coercion of captive queens represented a central pillar of Roman strategy. These tactics transformed powerful women into instruments of empire, compelling them to act against their own interests while ensuring the compliance of entire populations. The psychological, moral, and political dimensions of this oppression were profound, illustrating a form of control that extended far beyond visible punishment or enslavement. By examining these mechanisms, we gain insight into the subtle and sophisticated methods Rome employed to maintain dominance. Methods that combined fear, strategy, and psychological mastery to secure the loyalty and submission of both individuals and nations. In the lives of these captive queens, the machinery of empire is revealed in its most intimate and ruthless form, a system in which power was exercised not only through force, but through the manipulation of the human spirit itself. Suffering endured by captive queens at the hands of Rome did not vanish with the end of their immediate captivity. Rather, it left profound and lasting legacies, both personal and political, that echoed across generations and shaped the historical memory of the regions they once ruled. These legacies were complex, encompassing psychological trauma, cultural memory, political symbolism, and the erasure of individual and national identities. By examining the long-term consequences of Roman cruelty, we gain a deeper understanding of the multifaceted ways in which the empire exerted power and how the echoes of that power continued to influence societies long after the fall of the queens themselves. One of the most immediate legacies of captivity was the enduring psychological trauma experienced by these women. Queens, who had once wielded authority over armies, laws, and subjects, were thrust into a reality of extreme vulnerability. Many endured years of public humiliation, enslavement, sexual exploitation, coercion, and forced betrayal, leaving deep emotional scars. Even if a queen survived captivity and retained her life, she could never fully reclaim her previous sense of autonomy, authority, or dignity. The constant surveillance, manipulation, and moral compromises required to survive under Roman domination created lasting effects on mental health, leading in some cases to depression, despair, or early death. These individual traumas, while intensely personal, also carried symbolic weight, reinforcing the lesson that resistance to Rome came at a profound human cost. The political and social consequences of the queen's suffering were equally significant. Captivity often destabilized entire kingdoms and regions. With the queen removed from power, traditional lines of succession were disrupted, governance structures weakened, and local elites forced to navigate the complex politics of collaboration with Roman authorities. In many cases, the absence or subjugation of the queen left a power vacuum that Rome exploited, installing puppet rulers, dividing territories, or integrating conquered lands into the imperial system. The fate of a single queen could thus shape the political trajectory of an entire nation for decades, illustrating the profound link between personal suffering and systemic domination. Moreover, the experiences of these captive queens became embedded in cultural memory, often serving as cautionary tales for future generations. Chroniclers, poets, and local historians recorded, sometimes in fragmented or biased form, the ordeals of these women, highlighting their bravery, tragedy, and resilience. For example, Boudica of the Iceni became a symbol of both resistance and the high cost of defying Rome, remembered centuries later as an emblem of courage and suffering. Similarly, Uines in Gaul, Britannia, and the Near East, though sometimes less well documented, were remembered in folklore, oral traditions, and local narratives, their stories serving as reminders of the devastating consequences of conquest. Through this process, the suffering of captive queens transcended their personal experience, becoming part of the collective memory of their people and shaping regional identity long after the empire's military campaigns had ended. The legacy of suffering also extended to the family and descendants of captive queens. Forced marriages, coerced reproduction, and integration into Roman households often meant that the offspring of these unions were raised under the empire's influence, sometimes to prevent rebellion or to assimilate elite bloodlines into Roman society. In other cases, children of captive queens could be used as political pawns, their fates manipulated to secure loyalty or enforce submission among conquered populations. This intertwining of personal trauma with political strategy illustrates the long-term impact of captivity. The suffering of a single queen could reverberate through generations, shaping alliances, power structures, and cultural narratives. In addition to psychological and political legacies, the historical record itself reflects the erasure and marginalization of captive queens. Many of these women were deliberately omitted from Roman accounts or reduced to footnotes in the chronicles of military triumphs. Their identities, accomplishments, and agency were overshadowed by the narratives of their conquerors. This erasure was both a continuation of their subjugation and a tool of imperial propaganda, reinforcing the idea that Rome alone dictated history and memory. The absence of detailed accounts of these women's lives, struggles, and resilience has made it challenging for modern historians to fully reconstruct their stories. Yet even in their partial invisibility, the legacies of suffering remain discernible through the patterns of conquest, cultural trauma, and resistance they inspired. The enduring human and cultural impact of captivity is further evident in the psychological imprint left on societies that witnessed the subjugation of their queens. Communities internalized lessons of fear, obedience, and the consequences of resistance. The trauma was communal, not solely personal, affecting how societies organized themselves, how leaders negotiated with Rome, and how future rebellions were conceived and executed. The humiliation, exploitation, and coercion inflicted on queens sent a broader message. Rome's power was total, capable of reaching into the most intimate and symbolic aspects of society. This collective memory of suffering influenced social hierarchies, governance, and cultural attitudes for generations, shaping both the immediate post-to-conquest period and the long-term development of regional identities. Yet, despite the immense suffering and enduring trauma, there were also legacies of resilience and agency. Many queens found ways to assert influence even in captivity, protecting allies, negotiating limited privileges, or engaging in subtle forms of resistance. These acts, though often constrained and invisible to the public eye, demonstrate the persistence of human dignity in the face of systematic oppression. The stories of resilience, survival, and strategic acumen have survived through historical fragments, folklore, and legend, providing a counter-narrative to the narratives of domination and control imposed by Rome. In this way, the legacies of suffering were not solely destructive, they also bore witness to courage, intelligence, and endurance, inspiring future generations with examples of resistance against overwhelming odds. The study of these historical legacies also sheds light on the broader mechanisms of empire. By examining the fate of captive queens, historians can understand how Rome consolidated power, managed subjugated populations, and maintained long-term control over vast territories. The suffering of individual women illustrates the intimate link between personal experience and imperial strategy. Conquest was not only a matter of military success, but also of psychological manipulation, social engineering, and the control of symbols of authority. The legacies of captive queens reveal the human dimension of imperial expansion, highlighting how personal suffering and systemic oppression work together to sustain one of history's most enduring empires. In conclusion, the historical legacies of suffering endured by captive queens were profound and far-reaching. Their trauma extended beyond personal anguish, influencing political structures, social memory, family lineages, and cultural identity. While many of these queens were erased from official records or marginalized in Roman historiography, their stories of endurance, resilience, and tragedy continue to resonate, offering crucial insights into the human costs of conquest. By studying these legacies, we gain not only a clearer understanding of Roman imperialism, but also a deeper appreciation of the courage and resilience of women who, despite being stripped of power, dignity, and autonomy, left indelible marks on history. Their suffering, while deeply tragic, serves as a testament to the complex interplay of power, oppression, and resistance. A reminder that the impact of conquest reverberates long after the battlefield has been abandoned, shaping the lives, identities, and collective memory of entire peoples.